So good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Andrew Johnston. I'm the director of the UVA program in historic preservation. Tonight, our speaker is Max Page. Max Page is professor of architecture and history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and, quite interestingly, currently the president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, the union of 117,000 public school and college educators in Massachusetts. He's the author or editor of 10 books on cities, architecture, and historic preservation, including The Creative Destruction of Manhattan and Why Preservation Matters. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow and a Rome Prize recipient. Tonight, this event's supported by the Hanbury Endowment for Historic Preservation. Tonight, he'll be speaking on why preserving difficult places matters. So please join me in welcoming Max Page.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I've just had a wonderful visit. I feel right at home. I will never say the C word. I will only say grounds. I will also never call anyone doctor. Anyway, I've learned a lot of important things about how to behave here at UVA. But really, it's been a terrific visit. I had a wonderful visit to Monticello. Thank you very much to Noah and to Andy taking me there today. So really glad to be here. All right. Why am I starting here? This is James Turrell's Sky Space at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art. And I just was there last week, and it fit in perfectly with what I was thinking about here. If you've never been to James Turrell Space, you should visit them. And it's simply, you sit beneath the sky. But the perfect oculus there represents, in the words of Carsten Harries, the philosopher, represents the sky to you. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do in confronting and preserving and then interpreting difficult places is represent our own history to ourselves. That's the fundamental goal, and it is an essential goal for us in this troubling moment in our democracy. So that's why I'm hoping today we'll be talking about why preserving those difficult places matters. And I will forgive the advertisement, but mainly forget the title of the book, but look at the photograph, and I will come back to this at the end. There's a reason that in a book that lays out why preservation matters and how it should matter in our time that I chose this image, and I'll let you just sit with that. Many of you may know that building, but I will come back to it a little bit later. So I want to begin first by setting out the argument about my fundamental goal, and I think the goal for our historic preservation should be, which is to actually play a central role in our movements for a more progressive and just world. And one of those pieces is preserving and interpreting difficult places. But I want to give a background on some other ways that preservation can play that role, so you have the sense of my argument. Obviously, many of you know this quote, how long, not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So these are very grand, some of the most famous words in our history by Martin Luther King Jr. But it is not too much to suggest that a preservation movement that is vital and essential has to be addressing our fundamental goals, I think, of working towards justice. And as Andy mentioned, I am a professor of architecture at UMass, but I'm also a member of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, and now its president. We are the largest union in New England. We represent public school and college educators from pre-K through higher ed, community colleges, state universities, UMass, and all the public schools in Massachusetts. And I just showed this. This is actually a strike in Woburn. It's illegal to go on strike in Massachusetts, but our members bravely did that in order to win living wages for our paraprofessionals, teachers' aides, students, educators who work with the neediest of students. And here I was at one of our big strike actions. Now, I'm not just showing this to be gratuitous, but because the work that I've been doing there has, of course, fundamentally shaped my outlook and the kind of work that I do when I think about my academic work as well. So I want you to keep that in mind, and I'll come back to this at the very end. All right, so I'm gonna really fly through this in a way. So strap yourselves in. But I want to highlight some of the ways that how preservation has changed for the better, and how it has the capacity to be so much more fundamental to our work in the world. And obviously, this is Penn Station, demolished. It took 3 years to tear it down. Of course, in the distance, you see there the post office, which is now the new Penn Station, or the Moynihan train station in New York City. This is always my favorite, most terrible thing is in the current Penn Station, or the old Penn Station, meaning the old new Penn Station, they would show you what it used to look like while you were in this toilet bowl of a train station. I thought there was something insulting. Someone had a really sick sense of humor. But of course, the demolition of Penn Station was part of the effort then to save Grand Central and so many other great buildings. So it died so that so many others could live. And not just the grand structures, but also places like Stonewall Inn, important places of crucial events in our history, and cultural landscapes, places, stores that were central to the Latino community. This is a music store in the Bronx. And then more broadly, all the anonymous buildings, the texture of neighborhoods that were preserved in the wake of the 1966 Historic Preservation Act. So these are all ways in which preservation has made a tangible difference in our daily lives, in the places that are saved and allow us to then experience a better way of living. In other ways, preservation also can play, and has begun to play, a more central role in our climate fight. When we think of building a climate, is that me making that noise? That when we think about addressing climate change through building, so often it is things like this at Hampshire College, where Andy went to college, is the Kern Center, one of the few living buildings in the world. We actually have 2 in Western Mass. And of course, they are super important to the future, but actually, more important, preservation's role is to remind us that we need to preserve our way out of the climate crisis. There's so much carbon embedded in existing buildings. We need to preserve and reuse those buildings. We need to preserve the farmland, such as this. We need to take old barns, tobacco barns like this in Hadley, Massachusetts. We had tobacco long before you all did, sorry to say. 350 years ago, we had tobacco in Western Mass, and here we are, solar panels on these old tobacco barns. And we need to preserve cities like Holyoke, which, though it is one of the poorest cities, industrial cities where all the paper was made in 19th century United States, and it is a downtrodden city, but in fact, what you see there is the Connecticut River. Let's see if I can remember how to do this. And as the Connecticut River flows down and the water flows down these canals, it powered these massive factories, and still does. So that most of the power in that city, 150 years after these canals were built, are powered by those same turbines spinning, going through those canals. So preservation there is about also climate resilience. And you can see the flows as the water come through those tunnels. You can see those are called the sluices as they go from one level of canal back to another, and then down back into the river 80 feet lower down. Preservation, though, is going to have to change, and this is probably a whole other lecture, but I just want to allude to it, that in building more densely, we are going to have to adapt what we accept, what we're willing to accept in terms of building taller or adding additions to existing buildings. This is Mongkok in Hong Kong, the densest place on Earth. But we have to be willing to adapt in order to be climate resilient. We're also going to have to modify our sometimes over concern about architectural integrity in some buildings. Buildings like Monticello, we want to absolutely do that. But in regular buildings here, this is in Minneapolis, huge fight over, guess what, windows? When in fact, I would argue that if the goal of preservation is to be at the heart of a new climate resilience movement, we have to be willing to be more flexible in the kind of rules that are made around adaptive reuse. We also need, and I hope there's lots of architects in the room, architects and preservationists need to fully embrace building in old structures. And my time I got to spend in Rome, part of it was I spent visiting Carlo Scarpa projects, who is perhaps the very best at building modern within historic fabric. And this is the Castelvecchio in Verona, where you can feel the genius of the modern architect, and you also still feel the power of the historic building. But also David Chipperfield's Neues Museum in Berlin, or the Mercato Santa Caterina in Barcelona by Enric Miralles. You know, a fantastical new cover to this public marketplace. We have to be willing to embrace that if we are preserving and enhancing dense urban neighborhoods. We also have to be willing to do things like this is my building, the Fine Arts Center by Kevin Roche, in which we, rather than say we can't put solar panels on here because we have to protect the historic integrity of this famous building, in fact, let's embrace this. This is called the sun machine. He called it that in the late 60s. He didn't know about solar panels, but now we power the entire structure of this arts complex at my campus, the University of Massachusetts Amherst. In another arena as well, we need to confront, as preservationists, what's the impact of our work on economic development. So here's a wonderfully preserved part of the West Village. You may know this house right in the middle there off to the left, the brightest red, is the home of this woman, Jane Jacobs. Many of you may have read Death and Life of Great American Cities. I visited there a number of years ago, and it was selling for $3.5 million. It's actually would sell for a lot more now. So we look at this and say, success. We stopped the highway. She stopped the highway from going through there, which is terrific. But it's now a very, very wealthy neighborhood. You look out her window. This is from her window where she observed city life, looking out at Pain Quotidien, which is the fancy bakery. It's a signal of gentrification. Although I went back there and there was a clothing store now, and I noticed that the Chillax Fox Patch classic T-shirt was $120. So this is a neighborhood we've preserved the fabric of the buildings, but all the people who once lived in this really mixed income and more of a working class district have long disappeared. We have to confront that problem of gentrification. Similarly, this is my mother's house, the sort of the tan one, second in. The kosher butcher was on the first floor. This is Camden, New Jersey. They lived upstairs. If I talk about the Second Empire style and needing to preserve the architectural elements, that's not the main concern of the people in Camden, which is like Holyoke, one of the poorest cities in New Jersey. We have to be able to talk more directly to the economic needs of our neighborhoods and not purely from an architectural viewpoint. There are many examples around the world where people are considering alternative ways of doing things, and I will take you briefly in a few slides here to Havana, Cuba, where if you look in the distance, actually that's their capital, modeled after our capital. But we think of Havana as this incredibly preserved fabric of urban fabric, and it is indeed, but if you look on those second stories, you see clothes hanging, drying. Regular people live on the upper floors. So certainly tourist money comes in and lives in the hotels and the restaurants down below. But up above, regular people are living. It's not perfect. There's lots of corruption. There's lots of things going wrong. But there's also some really powerful element here, including hiring thousands and thousands of young people, training them in the arts of preservation, and now they are deployed to restore the old part of the old city of Havana. So the city historian owns the entire downtown of Havana, uses it to bring in hard currency, but also uses it to build homes for regular people. In Berlin, a place my father grew up there, and I've spent some time there. This is the International Building Exhibition. It was a lot of the postmodern architects like Peter Eisenman and lots of other people got their start. John Haydock, many others got their start in Berlin in this late 70s and 1980s project. And people focus on those buildings, like Peter Eisenman's building at Checkpoint Charlie, once was one of the main crossover spots to East Germany. But more importantly was the other part of the International Building Exhibition, IBA, it was called IBA, which was the renovation of the Mietskaserne, the apartment complexes of the working classes from the 19th century, and turning those into homes and revitalizing those whole neighborhoods by taking anonymous buildings, renovating them with often self-help of the homeowner, the renters themselves, into new homes for the city. So for this is again where preservation actually plays a central role in building a more equitable city. It did not get gentrified because so many of these, as I say, they're called Mietskaserne. These are sort of rental barracks, got renovated and protected as affordable housing. Or back in where I work in Boston, land trusts, the Dudley Street Land Trust has hundreds of homes in an area that is rapidly gentrifying, pulling things out of the private market to preserve them. It's not the buildings, the architecture of the buildings that is important. It's the fabric of this city, the regularity of the buildings, the sort of basic urban form, but also the fact that the people inside will be protected from the onslaught of gentrification. Last example of Theaster Gates, some of you know him as an artist, urban planner on the south side of Chicago, taking over these bank buildings to create not new condos, but a public library. Or in the youth build partnerships of Push Buffalo. Push Buffalo is this incredible grassroots community economic development group. And so they are training young people in the arts of green preservation, adaptive reuse. And so preservation becomes a way towards good, solid jobs. So these are just examples of the way preservation can get away from being accused of being elitist, a gentrifying force, but actually a force for greater economic equity. And Rick Lowe, also, some of you know, the architect, has built the project Row Houses in Houston. And just this final example of this is back in Boston, in Dorchester. You can see there's a big march of the organization City Life Vida Urbana. What they are doing is, you see the No One Leaves shield. They block evictions. They block share. They literally get arrested. They block evictions of people. And here they are showing up at a 19th century home that preservationists would say, we need to protect this for its architectural value. But they're preserving it to keep the people in their homes. This is a way where preservation can join together with housing activists, so that they're not opposed to preserving a historic building, but they may want to make sure that the people in there get to stay in there, long-standing residents in there, and that's where they are blocking any evictions of this home. Okay, so those are the ways. These are some of the ways in which preservation, I think, can and must be part of a more progressive world for climate resilience, economic equity, and telling a broader set of stories. Some of you know this, the novelist Milan Kundera, and this is, I won't need to read this, you can read it yourself. But what he argues very simply is that, as you can see, a key part of erasing a history of a people or peoples within a country is by erasing their history, and often that is erasing the physical past. So this is a crucial part of our work, especially in a country of such great diversity, and also a country which really the land is bathed in blood in this country, right? Can we all accept that is the story of this country is of enormous violence to a lot of different people, from Native Americans to African Americans to immigrant groups. There is tension and battle over the centuries, and yet we still strive to have a democracy. So confronting these difficult places is absolutely essential, and I would say it's not just confronting our history. I believe in history books, I believe in the writing, I believe in our curriculum, but confronting our difficult history in place and actually in the physical landscape is fundamental. And it's not enough to write about it or make documentaries, as much as those are important parts of the historical ecosystem. We need to preserve places that people can visit and confront a past that they may not know about. For instance, a place that I did not know about until I started just a few years back, Shockoe Bottom. I know many of you know about this. I'm entering dangerous territory because I'm going to be talking about Richmond, and I'm talking a little bit Charlottesville, Confederate monuments, and I'm really right in the heart of it. So many of you know about these stories, but I had, even though as a historian, PhD in U.S. history, had not learned about Shockoe Bottom, the largest slave trading site in 19th century America. And this is a picture of that Devil's Half Acre, it's called, the prison and holding pen, frankly, for enslaved peoples on their way to be sold. And that, the embankment up above there is I-95. So I had driven over the remains, the graves of African-American people, but I had not known what I was doing until I wrote a piece and learned about the struggle there. But I will come back to this in a second. I want to take a diversion out to some other countries that I think have some models for us about how we confront difficult paths. And one is very close to me. This is my father's photo album from the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. So he lived there, and you can see the city festooned in great celebration with swastikas all up and down the main street, Unter den Linden, main street still, to right through the heart of Berlin. And he fled in 1937. But I've had this ongoing, lifelong kind of dialogue with that country and its past. But Berlin is a place where they are not silent about their history. And many of you know the Daniel Libeskind Jewish Museum Project, in dialogue with the Berlin Museum, the City History Museum, very front and center, very aggressive in its highlighting of the fracture of German history. There's, of course, the Eisenman memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. Here's 4 acres right next to the Reichstag, the Parliament building. It would be like putting a monument, massive monument to slavery, right at the front steps of the Capitol building in D.C. I will note, we're talking a little bit about like meanings attached to places. Eisenman meant this, though he did not have a message, a simple message. And in fact, he also did not have rules. The police around there on the opening of the memorial, they were telling people not to climb on these, what they were called Stellai, not to climb on them. And he said, I didn't make that rule. This is now, it's done. I'm done with my design. Now it becomes a monument that the city has to decide what it wants to do with it. They've also in Berlin uncovered on archaeology. In fact, it was sort of grassroots archaeologists who uncovered the headquarters of the Nazi SS building that had been covered over after World War II, not to be brought out into the open light. Activists said, no, we need to see these places where people were tortured and where much of the enforcement of Nazi policies took place. They did bring in also famous architects like Norman Foster to redo the dome of the Reichstag, the Parliament building, open and transparent, so you literally can be up there looking down at the workings of Parliament. They've also employed and paid for and given grants to just thousands of artists, including Shimon Atti, who did these Berlin projections. So for just, in the evenings, he would project Jewish life into the doorways and windows of buildings in Berlin. And of course, they would disappear after that. But they sort of, for a moment, brought to life a world that was now destroyed. And of course, this has become now ubiquitous, but the Stolpersteine, stumble steps, these simple brass stones that are, plaques that were put in front of homes where Jewish families lived before they were sent off to the concentration camps. This has now become the largest memorial in the world in terms of its expanse. There's thousands and thousands, not just in Berlin, but all over Germany, and we now see it being copied in other places. When I was in Italy, activists have now started putting Stolpersteine in front of houses of political activists against Mussolini. And then perhaps the most powerful of all for me is this. In the center of the city, you cross this plaza, and literally, there's no sign that you would know this was there. You have to come across what was about maybe a meter or a little bit more than maybe a meter, 5 feet by 5 feet glass And then you look down, and it's a big room, empty room of bookshelves. And this is Alfred Ullmann's Bibliothek in Babelplatz. Babelplatz is the place where the Nazis had many of their book burnings. And so you see here, you come across this in the middle of this plaza, and you are literally shaken out of your whatever you were thinking about, and then you see all the books that were burned. And of course, next to there is a Heinrich Heine quote that says, "People who burn books eventually burn people." And that's written in the early 19th century. And so it's very, very powerful monument. And Germany really pioneered innovative, challenging monuments. And what they most wanted to prevent is this wonderful German word called Kranzwerfstelle. It's one of those composite words. It means wreath-throwing place. What they did not want is a place where a fancy person, some prime minister would come, drop a wreath, and then forget about it and go to lunch. They wanted to challenge the forgetfulness of most monuments and most historic places. And that was the kind of driving force. We'll never forget, never again. And that required an artistic response in historic places. Germany really inspired so many artists in the United States and all around the world. Here is actually an artist I came to know, an American artist living for years in Buenos Aires, where this is a prison where some of the political prisoners during the era of the dictatorship, 1970s to 1984, where the dictatorship in Argentina murdered 30,000 of its own citizens. Some of them were imprisoned in this prison that they were tearing down finally. And what he did is as the building was going down, he got permission, as you can see here, to poke out different parts of the glass brick to create these pixelated images of some of the prisoners that had been held there, knowing that, as you can see, the building eventually would disappear. That was part of the idea, the return of the memory work back to the citizenry. So in this effort to not forget, one direction was to say, we'll preserve and interpret these sites. Another is to say, we're going to make a monument at a site and have it disappear, with the obligation returning to the citizenry. It's a very risky approach, but it's also very powerful, I think, a powerful philosophy. Another place, of course, and I edited a book about the many sites of terror in Buenos Aires, as well as the memorials to those places. And one of the most famous ones is ESMA, which is the Naval Academy, which was one of the main torture sites during that dictatorship of the late 70s and 80s. Of course, they're preserving the buildings. They tell the stories there. They also use the outsides, as you can see, for an endless series of art exhibits and installations. But one thing I want to highlight is when you go there, at least when I went there, they insisted you go for a long tour, a 3-hour tour, because it involves conversation and stopping and pausing to have discussion about what people have seen. That's a big commitment, I understand, but they were very committed, Memoria Abierta, open memory, the group that ran these, because they insisted that for the place to be meaningful, you needed to stop and consider and look to one another and have conversation. And I think that's one of the most exciting parts of, and most important parts of the preservation of difficult places movement, is that we insist on promoting dialogue about these places, because that is the beginning of something different. Just a brief note to see that one of the things they did is they started these kind of almost like train signs, train line signs of all the different places where the murders and torture took place in Argentina. It was a direct copy, intentionally, of a site in the heart of Berlin at the Wittenberg transit station. And I simply show these to say that there has been a real international dialogue of ideas about how to confront, difficult places or sites of conscience. These are places that I feel like there's an active movement for memory. It's really worth noting. of course, another place I spent a lot of time, as I mentioned, in Rome. There's, in fact, a unwillingness to confront Italy's role and connection and with Mussolini and fascism. It's kind of remarkable how much of the remains of the iconography, such as this Il Duce, our leader, which is repeated 256 times in this plaza, this massive plaza, which is the main plaza going to the main sports stadium. And people just walk right over that with all kinds of other terrible indications built into this plaza. And there's a place where they are simply not interested in confronting that history. We, of course, have our own places. So I'm just sort of circling back to the United States. And we have, in the past years, become much more willing because of activists. It's not natural. It's not the weather that changed. It's that people demanded. And I would argue that it comes, much of this comes out of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, all these feeding on each other, demanding to be told as part of the story of the United States. And that includes Manzanar and the Japanese internment. Of course, the buildings are all gone. They were all temporary, and much of it was erased, but we now have a national park there, and it is being interpreted, I think, very, very well. Civil rights sites that are falling apart have been protected. When I first went to Money, Mississippi, where Emmett Till was murdered, there was nothing except the falling down famous store, which you may know of, where whatever happened there, the result of it was Emmett Till's torture and murder, and the building was completely falling down. Now they're using it for tourism. Bryant's Grocery has in front of it this sign. I did go back, and there was actually bullet holes in a previous sign, and then they replaced it again. But there is at least the beginnings of the marking of the site, and there is a whole civil rights trail, of course, throughout the South. I will say, however, that for most buildings in our system, this is what you get when you're in the National Register of Historic Places. We have not been nearly as innovative until, I think, recent years in supporting the interpretation of historic places. So often the job ended with a listing of a building. And there's nothing in our historic preservation law, 1966, the federal law, that says you have to tell the story for the public of this place. It has to be documented, sits in some file, it's increasingly getting digitized, but there was no obligation to actually tell the story. There was no money specifically, certainly not federally, to hire artists and historians and the like to tell the story of these important places. But of course, we have many examples of this. Many examples of, I think, terrific, powerful artist interventions, such as Krzysztof Widuszko, the Bunker Hill Monument, projecting images of grieving mothers and kind of the drug and crime wave in Boston, projected on this Revolutionary era a monument to the American Revolution battle. But this is about the violence and pain in Boston. Or recognizing on the many vacant lots and walls in Philadelphia, the mural arts program in Philadelphia and in Los Angeles and Chicago. This is some of the most exciting, I think, public artwork going on is in these mural arts programs around these cities. Or recently, a Philadelphia Monument Lab was really interrogating what do we mean by a monument with these empty pedestals, as we are now seeing increasingly in the wake of the pulling down the Confederate monuments. I also recently was in Tulsa, where they are, in some ways, they've built a museum to the Tulsa Massacre, 1921, but are only really beginning to confront this in the landscape. There's a marker of Greenwood, the neighborhood, Black Wall Street, as it was called, this very prosperous black neighborhood, which that very fact provoked this massacre in 1921. But they, too, are using this theme of the Stolpersteine in the sidewalks to mark the places, the former businesses and people who lived there before the massacre. Of course, much of the neighborhood has been taken over by a casino and minor league baseball stadium, which often happens this is like a second wave of urban renewal. Many of these places were cut through, as you could see, from this highway cutting through this black neighborhood after, of course, many years after the massacre. And then now the way to further obliterate it is to bring in a profit-making enterprise that probably drains much of the economic life out of there. So now let me talk a bit about the Confederate monuments or monuments of that period, because we have thousands of these all across the country, all the monuments. And this is not in the South. This is in Boston. This is a copy of the D.C. monument. It's called Lincoln and the Kneeling Slave, right? And you can see, I think, from here, a race set free and the country at peace. Lincoln rests from his labors. I mean, it's kind of such an appalling statement, and yet it was in Capitol Hill, and it was in Boston until very recently, right near the Common, or near one of the biggest hotels. And it was there for years till finally removed. And this is one approach that we are engaged with now, which is removal. And this is finally just last year removed. It is an old tradition in Berlin. They also took away in East Berlin, statues of Lenin and Marx and many others, and changed names back to what the names they used to be. And we are doing this in many different places. And I want to suggest, I've actually come to think it was the right move, but I can also am concerned about it, about what happens when we may remove one history and replace it with another, as terrible as this is. And this, of course, is the Battle of Liberty Place monument, erected in I think 1891. And you can see literally this says the reinstating, or the national election recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state. And finally, just a few years ago, this was removed as well. And of course, most famously of all is Monument Avenue, listed often as the most beautiful street in the United States, despite these monuments to Confederate leaders. And there's, of course, Lee, Jefferson Davis. And during the time that I was in Richmond working on the Shockoe Bottom work with students, which you'll see about in a little bit, there was a great exhibit about alternatives. What should we do? Should we simply blow it up? Should we flip it on its head? Should we auction it off, in a kind of ironic statement? And of course, at the moment, the desire was simply to remove it and consider what comes next. And there is the monument, plastered with graffiti, but with the monument itself removed. And of course, this spurred backlash. This is, of course, in New Orleans, the Lee Monument, that eventually also was removed. And I will say one of the most powerful things that convinced me, let me just step back, my inclination as a historian and preservationist is always want to preserve layers of history. And so that we would want to reinterpret a terrible monument. We would want to add new monuments or new artwork to be in dialogue with that. And I could convincingly make that case to you that is really important. But there was actually you may have known about this when Mayor Mitch Landrieu of New Orleans gave a speech saying what convinced him to say, finally, this needs to be removed. The Lee Monument needs to be taken down. Was his friend, politicians always say they have friends, but I think they actually are friends. And in fact, they may have been classmates. Wynton Marsalis, musician, the trumpeter. And he had said how insulting it was to go to school and have to walk by this monument, this towering monument. And of course, these monuments were designed to intentionally occupy and take over and dominate public space. And that for me was a kind of a convincing point that for all my fears about how we might take away one history, replace it with another, or we might forget how we once had these monuments there, it was convincing that these monuments had their time far too long, and now they needed to be removed and replaced. And that was a very, very powerful Landru's speech, as well as Wynton Marsalis's own writing on why and how could it be that this city could allow for this massive monument and many others to dominate the landscape, to speak for the citizens of New Orleans long after we had allegedly rejected this kind of philosophy. I will note that another approach is to simply eliminate one monument and build brand new ones, such as in Boston, we took away that Lincoln monument I mentioned before, and now have built a monument, I think really in compensation, nearby, a few blocks away on the Common, the Boston Common, the monument to the Kings, Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King, who met in Boston. And it's based on them embracing when he won the Nobel Prize, and this becomes the monument of that embrace. And I will say to me, there's something beautiful about it, and it's also something troubling, because there's an effort somehow to celebrate their love, and there's a very optimistic tone to this monument when Boston has barely begun to confront its terrible past. In fact, this coming year is the 50th anniversary of the school desegregation busing plans in Boston that produced just incredible outpouring of open, violent racism as white areas resisted desegregation. So I'm not sure the tone of a monument that's sort of celebratory is the right one at this moment. It's a debatable point. Other approaches, many of you have seen the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, by Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative. There he is. But what I wanted to emphasize is both the soil that was brought in from places across the South where lynching had taken place and brought to this site, but also that all on the outside are these blocks with the names of those who'd been lynched and the county and the place where they were, and what they are sitting waiting intentionally, like laid out, waiting for the community to say, we're ready to display this at these sites of these lynchings. And so the proof of success of the work is when all of the things you see on the screen disappear, because they've now gone back to actually occupy space in the actual places where those lynchings took place. And so slowly, bit by bit maybe, but not inevitably, that will happen. You can see most are still here. And here's an example. As best they know, obviously many are unknown, and their names unknown. But I think it's a very powerful notion of challenging communities to confront their difficult history. Another approach, of course, you know this, Stone Mountain. And here's a close-up of that. When I first moved to Atlanta, my very first job teaching was at Georgia State University, and the students felt they should show me the sites, and that included the laser show at Stone Mountain, which many of you have seen, or many of you know. At the very end, as they say, the roar of the crowd, and the boys will ride again. It's a terrifying moment in many ways. So what to do with this? And there's been lots of debate about it, but one of the ideas that I think I like best, this is a more recent photograph, and you can see the monument is fading. Some, of course, would like to restore it. This is a case where I think maybe the best answer is actually simply let it decay and die over time. And as we watch it decay, so not actively destroy it, that would be another approach, but one way is also simply to let it slowly and steadily disappear. And it reminds me of one of the other great Holocaust memorials. This is by Joachim Gertz in Harburg, a monument against fascism, where there's this good, standard column of a memorial, and everyone could write on it or write whatever their messages were, and slowly and steadily it went underground until finally it's gone. And the idea is that again, the monument disappears, but we are then told to to hold on to that memory, however we want to see it. All right, I want to take you briefly to Richmond and to Shockoe Bottom, because I think the project that I and my students worked on, trying to give you a little bit of a sense of what I see as a pathway forward. And I'll try to do this fairly quickly. Many of you know this site, and this is obviously Shockoe Bottom here. This is, as I said, the largest site of enslaved people being bought and sold in the 19th century. And there's some famous painting of that event, of those events that happen daily. It's important also geographically. There is the Capitol building, and then on the other side is the church where Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." So all above this site. So it's a very powerful, important site in our terrible history. And of course, well, look what has happened to it. It was covered over. The river, the bottoms, the river was covered over. Highways came through. Train line came through. And of course, to add more indignity, the answer is let's propose a minor league baseball stadium, casino, hotels, etc. And it was people like Anna Edwards who started an organization called the Defenders of the Ancestors, who said we have to push back against this. And she's here on a site that was a parking lot of the VCU Medical Center, but was in fact the African American graveyard. And right beneath, and again, the embankment there is I-95. So part of here and underneath I-95 were ancestors and enslaved people who were working in this area or being bought and sold. And she said something very powerful once. She said, "We have the right to know about the ancestors who lived, worked, bought, and sold here in this site." And so, here you can see this is the burial ground, as best they can mark it. And yearly on Juneteenth, there is a march throughout, not just that area, but through the whole zone of Shockoe Bottom. That was an integrated community and industrial spaces and trading spaces of this trade. We had a whole series of community meetings and looked at this site. You can see kind of outlined the main site, the 4 acres it came to focus on. And one of the ideas, of course, was to have a memorial park, a place to remember and honor the ancestors. This is the area that you saw before, where the graveyard, the cemetery was. But we also wanted to make this a place of new economic revitalization. So Virginia Union University was founded, actually, had its first classes in a building on that site. So we felt like, let's bring education back. So there would be a center for building arts, as well as a community garden on that site to not just have it be a memorial site, but actually part of the revitalization of the city. But we also wanted to replace, effectively, the Monument Avenue with a new set of monuments. And so these light towers, which I think you can see a little bit better here, using these, you can see the kind of the pixelated images is actually of Gabriel, the enslaved man who launched an unsuccessful revolt in the 1800, and that these columns would light up the sky and become and they would be monuments of and memorials to important African American figures in the city's history in place of the Confederate generals. So that was the notion behind that. It was also, and here is a museum that is being planned there. But the key is, and the part that was hardest, is to talk about a plan where you were building a memorial park, telling the history, but also figuring out how to do equitable revitalization. And that is the thing we are worst at, I would argue, because it required a kind of a level of planning I don't think we normally do. In other words, the normal thing to do is to see what businesses will come in, see what developers will come in to build housing or businesses. And that will not necessarily benefit the descendants of the enslaved people who worked here and were bought and sold here. So that is something we continue to lift up, but it was hard actually to get much traction around seeing equitable economic development as part and parcel of dealing with this difficult place. Okay, let me come sort of wrapped to the end here, and I want to show this image, which of this it's by Mimo Yodache, an artist that I came across on my very first day or two of being at the American Academy in Rome. And in some ways, this looks to be like an example of preservation, right? We take something broken and we put it back together. That's one way of understanding it. We repair it, make it accessible, we fix the past. But look at this. This is, it's not really fixed perfectly at all, and the moment the person takes away their hand, it will all fall down again. And actually, this is in some ways a terrific metaphor for what we are supposed to be doing with difficult places. We're never going to have perfection. The past will not be made whole, but we have to bring people to these places with the gentle holding hand so that we can confront our past and have dialogue about it. And so, coming here to Charlottesville, and thinking about the terrible events in the wake of the march, and then the challenge taking down the Lee statue in the city, and of course, just very recently, we've all read about, and I read about with great interest, being taken down and melted down. And now, of course, the question is, what happens next? And that is the site. Thank you for Jessica and Andy taking me there the other day. So, it's a site waiting for the next step. And I know that the Swords into Plowshares group is planning to reuse the melted down Confederate statue and to create something new. And I guess I just want to end by suggesting a direction. And part of that comes from, again, having toured around here and seeing the really very powerful monument to enslaved laborers at the university. I was there the other night with the central grounds in the background. And obviously you're struck by their names. There's Sawyer, but there's also brother and father. And then there's the names of the work: farmer, blacksmith, joiner. And there's something very powerful about that, because it reminds us of a very simple fact, which I think sometimes is lost, which is that slavery was fundamentally a system of labor exploitation that used the oppression, that used hate, that built a hatred of black people in order to profit from their labor. It was a violent, oppressive system, but it's fundamentally a labor system and a capitalist system. I think it's important to remember that. Sometimes it gets lost. There was not, as many of you probably know, before there was the slavery that you came to know, there was indentured servitude. There was different types of laborers, of different white, Native American, African American. There was not the kind of rigid white supremacist slavery system that came to dominate in the South. And I think there's something in there about respecting the labor that was done, and the labor that was stolen, and the value that was stolen from those workers. And I saw the other monument to the coat and tie rebellion. I think I'm the only person wearing a tie, so I did that in honor of UVA's traditions. But I was struck by that coat and tie rebellion in 1969, because what the protesters were arguing for was an African American dean of admissions, a Black Studies program, and higher wages and unionization for the workers on campus. And I thought that was a powerful notion, that they were linking together the desire to tell the history of African Americans in this region, on this campus, but also to raise the economic standing of those very people. And I take you back quickly to the former Lee Park, and that what you can't quite see in the distance, but you all probably know, is that this was a homeless encampment. And there are still men there. These are people, I don't know where they come from, but they are descendants of a system of exploitation that has continued to oppress structurally African American people in this country. These are people, whatever is going on, they deserve work, they deserve homes, they deserve support if there were drug issues. We have to think about a way of confronting these sites that also builds a better society. And I'd take you in the final slides actually back to my own home, to that building you saw, the Fine Arts Center at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And I show this, it seems odd, like I just went from that place to this. But it's because I've thought a lot about this building, in part because it was, for much of its history, considered ugly. It was at the tail end of a brutalist period, and then people said, this is terrible, ugly. At some point, we were the second ugliest campus in the country, and I've come to love this building. And part of it's because, over the year, this is when it early on, I think it's quite powerful because it was on these reflecting pools. The heavy concrete actually looked like it was sitting in water. But it's more than that. It's that this is a building that was built with state and federal funds, largest arts complex west of Boston, and it was designed for working class kids to have the finest facilities for art, music, dance, and theater. So now that I know that, I look at the building and I see something glorious, and I don't look simply at the architecture. And part of the desire that we have had an effort at UMass to do much more preservation and celebration of these buildings is they represented a different time and different kind of public commitment. And similarly, why I put this up at the beginning, this of course is the New York Public Library, one of the most glorious interior spaces in the United States, I would argue. But what it is more important even than the architecture, which I do believe in palaces for the people, and I believe in that. I believe that we should celebrate the architecture of this building. But it's also that it's one of the greatest libraries in the world, and it's open to everyone for free. And so I would go there when I was writing my dissertation, and you would sit down at a table, and you would have someone studying for the SAT, the LSAT. There was someone else just writing poetry, someone else mumbling to themselves, all open to everyone. So I guess I want to just end by saying that even if we've traveled far and wide and back around to these difficult places, what I said actually I think in the description for the talk today was why preservation was so important for helping us to confront this difficult history, but also to chart a more equitable future. And we can only do that if we look not only at what we build and preserve, but also the kind of equity we bring to the citizens that come to those places. So, thank you very much.